Okay, welcome to video 10.6. Today we're going to be talking about solving quadratics by using the quadratic formula. So by the end of this video, I'm hoping that you'll be able to use the quadratic formula to solve quadratics for the zeros. So completing the square and factoring are not always the best method to use when solving a quadratic equation. Why are completing the square and factoring not good options for the quadratic below? Well, in order to answer this question, let's first try to complete the square and factor it. So we'll try completing the square first. In order to complete the square, it has to be equal to 0, which when I look at this quadratic, it is. Then I look and I see, oh, but there's 7p squareds. I don't want to complete the square 7 times, so we're going to divide out the 7. And remember, we do this with only the variables that we're trying to complete the square with. When I do that, I get 7p outside, and then I have the p squared, but then I see this negative 12 divided by 7. That doesn't come out nice. So then I'm going to have a fraction of negative 12 sevenths p. And then I left my blank so I can complete the square. Well, if I complete the square, how do we do that? I need to divide 12 sevenths in half. And then I need to square that because remember that's how we fill in the square. Well, if I write that out, I see this 1/2 times negative 12 over 7 squared. That's a lot of fractions. And that's icky. So I don't think completing the square is the best option here. Okay, so completing the square was not a good option here. So now let's try factoring. So it's a trinomial, so I'll have to do x box factoring. So let's set that up on the right side over here. So here I've rewritten the 7p squared minus 12p plus 4. So if I'm going to factor, I see that there is not a GCF here that I can take out. Then I look to see if it's a D2PS, and it's not 2, so it's definitely not a difference of 2 perfect squares. So then I say, okay, I've got to set up the X box, and then if you want to write the PS for product sum, so you know that you're finding the product of top and the sum to be the bottom number. So 7 times 4 is 28. And the b number is negative 12, so that goes in the bottom. So I need two numbers that have a product of 28 and a sum of negative 12. When I go through the factors, I quickly realize that there are no factors that will multiply to be a positive 28 but have a sum of negative 12. So that means that this trinomial cannot be factored. Now, just because I figured this out, that doesn't mean that there aren't roots. If we put this in our calculator, we would see that it does cross the x-axis, but we can't find them with these two methods. So that's why there's another way, using the quadratic formula. Now, the quadratic formula is given to you on your formula sheet, so you do not have to memorize it. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So the procedure for using the quadratic formula. First, we must have the equation equal to 0 so that it's in standard form, just like we've done for all the ways of solving for the roots. And it's important to note that we can have an a value that is greater than 1, whereas we talked about in completing the square, we wanted to make sure that it was always 1 before we completed the square. The next step is just to identify your A, B, and C values. So I always write them down off to the side. So we're going to do that with this quadratic over here. First, it is in standard form because everything's on the left side. I have a positive x squared, which is good, and it's equal to 0. So I'm going to write out my A, B, and C numbers. So A is 2, B is negative 12, and C is 14. Once I've done that, I just plug all my values into the quadratic formula. So first I'm going to just rewrite everything here, but replace with my values that are here. So x equals, and we substitute in, so it's a negative 12, plus or minus the square root of negative 12 squared minus 4 times 2 times 14, all divided by 2 times 2. And we need to simplify. So negative 12 becomes 12. Plus or minus, and now remember that when you substitute in under the radical, you have to put this in parentheses, especially when it's a negative, because it'll only square the 12 otherwise, and then you have the negative. So you have to be very careful of that. So we put this all under, everything that's under the radical in our calculator, using parentheses exactly the way we see it. And when we do that, we get the square root of 32. And that's all divided by 4. Next we simplify the radical, so this will become radical 16 times 2. Which will then simplify to 4 radical 2, and we replace that in the problem. Lastly, now we need to simplify by doing the pretzel method division. So when I divide 12 by 4, I get 3, and then the 4 divided by 4 cancels, so that just becomes the radical 2. And that's our final answer here. Okay, we'll go over this more in class. Have a good night.